Hello and welcome to Husch Blackwell's Labor Law Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Godar, and together with my Husch Blackwell colleagues and thought leaders from around the country, we will discuss and explore the ever-changing issues in the world of labor law. President Biden promised to be the most pro-union president ever, and he is fulfilling that promise. The next 4 years promises to be a wild ride, so buckle up and join us on the Labor Law Insider Podcast. Welcome once again to the Labor Law Insider Podcast. This is Tom Godar, your host, and today, once again, I'm joined by my colleague and partner, Anne Mayette, one of the members of our Chicago Husch Blackwell office. Anne and I began a discussion in our last podcast about the changes we're seeing in the manufacturing and distribution industry. Anne had taken a look at some surveys and some activities of unions and discovered that there's more organizing activity and more strikes and work stoppages and other activities than we've seen in decades. I've had a 40-year watch on the bench of these activities, and I couldn't agree more, Anne, that there's a lot going on. We had spent some time talking about some of the scholarship that you had reviewed before the podcast, but today I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the anecdotes that you've read about in terms of how employees frankly feel disengaged and some of the steps that employers can take in order to remain engaged with their workforce and discourage the employees from seeking unions as a third party to solve problems that really shouldn't exist. And share with us some of the anecdotes you've heard about and how they tie into employee engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really found these anecdotes to be the most compelling and interesting to get the real voice of the employee. For example, there was a mechanical technician with a steel manufacturer who said that he really felt he had that employee engagement because his employer was willing to train him, send him to workshops in school to build his career path, that the employer had given him as much work as he wanted with no limit of overtime. And then, a big one, and I think I mentioned this before, and it was one of the reasons that there were a lot of demands was, a focus on employee safety. So those were the issues that he had identified that really had helped with engagement. Another kind of testimonial came from a mechanical technician with a producer of specialty gases. And that employee thought it was really important that there was room for growth and there was a specific training path and that, managers had experience in the jobs that they supervise so that they could, get the training and that the managers really understood what the employee was doing on a day-to-day basis. And then the last testimonial that I found really interesting was a medical calibration technician with a medical device manufacturer. He said, he thought it was important that he was paid what he's worth, that he could work overtime when he wants, but also had a good work-life balance and a relaxed atmosphere where they could speak with the managers and have that open dialogue. So I think these testimonials are really telling in order to see what it looks like from the employee's perspective on engagement.
Well, and let's be honest, these are not always easy to accept as an employer. I've spoken in groups of 20 and 2,000 and said, please raise your hand if you think you're overpaid. And quite honestly, I do not see a forest of hands at that. And likewise, one of the ways in which employers have to discipline their workplace in order to have products or services that are cost competitive is to limit overtime or at least have a rational way in which employees work. So some of these things create tensions. At a minimum, the employer and the employees have to have a chance to have a dialogue about them. And so the employee feels that she or he is being heard, I'm guessing.
Yep, I think you hit the nail on the head with that, Tom. It's just the ability to have that dialogue and the understanding. I think a little bit of, information and background for the employees with that open dialogue will give them a better perspective. I think you really see a lot of times in the workplace that there is a little bit of a disconnect between employees and employers on what goes into making the business run, what's required, how they can move the business forward, and the employees' part in that. So having that open dialogue so the employees understand, why the managers or the employer is making the decisions that they're making goes a really long way in really engaging the employees and making it a better workplace.
Well, and we're talking primarily manufacturing, but certainly this is true in all sorts of industries, whether it's fast food or hospitality, whether it's healthcare. There's a certain training loop, shorter or longer, depending upon the job and in terms of how long it might be to be an efficient employee. But when you have engaged employees, they continue to work rather than having to go through that training loop time and time again. When you have a W-2 at the end of the year and you have 200 employees and you have 450 W-2s, not a good day, because all of the work and that went into hiring and training all of those folks. If you can reduce that, it's got to be a very cost-effective step for our employers. So what is it that employees are looking at when they say they want to be engaged?
Yes.
How likely are the engaged employees to leave and, in this case, to select a union to speak for them because no one else is listening?
So really, when we're kind of looking at what does engagement look like for employees, I think a lot of times people think the first thing that comes to mind is pay. And I think that's not necessarily the case. It's a factor, but 64% of employees that are paid at market rates still feel underpaid and undervalued. So, increasing pay is not necessarily going to drive engagement. Instead, employees, and especially employees in the manufacturing sector, they're really looking for the employers to value their opinions because they feel like they have no voice in the workplace. Like we talked about, more of an open outlet for communication and for their voices to be heard, to have that dialogue. They want some decisional rights. They want some buy-in on what's happening in the workplace because they're feeling irrelevant and they want to change this. It's kind of the mantra of, if you trust me, I will feel relevant mentality. And really just that more engagement with leadership.
We just finished a wonderful podcast with our colleague Rufino Gaitan, and Rufino and I were talking about New Year's resolutions to maintain a union-free status. And we talked about reviewing handbooks, listening to employees, training supervisors, those kinds of things. But when you and I talked, some of the issues that you brought up as continuing employee engagement were outside of sort of that bedrock centerpiece. Tell us a few other things that you've learned in your research regarding employee engagement that maybe not every employer would or HR department would think of right away.
So I think some of the things that employers can look at to think outside of the box on engagement is broader messaging to all employees, like we talked about, conducting those employee engagement surveys, setting up a mechanism, a way to either formalize, two-way communication with employees and leadership, potentially setting up, town halls or something to that effect where employees feel like they can be in front of leadership and having that dialogue. Training your leaders in developing positive employee relations. And in the same aspect as that, analyzing your policies for vulnerabilities. One of the big things that a lot of employees were talking about was safety. So looking at those safety policies again to see if there's anything that can be improved upon. I think a big one, and this is a big one that we've seen a lot recently, is diversity, equity, and inclusion training and recruitment. This has been recognized as something that's pretty important to employees. So investing in and conducting that DE&I training and recruitment. And just in general, like some of the testimonials, employees are really looking to further themselves, further their careers. So investing in employee training, where employees can really feel like the employer is investing in them, in their advancement in their career. I think that is a very, very big thing that employers could be looking at. Some of the other things because, employees value their work-life balance, value how they are, active in the community is connecting with the local community as the employer, finding ways to connect your employees, connect the business with things that are going on in the local community, and really making it a really more well-rounded experience for the employee.
Well, I know that here at Husch Blackwell in our various offices, people creatively get engaged in volunteering together or taking on community issues together and that sort of thing. Is that what we're talking about here, this connecting with local communities, or are you just talking about an advertising campaign locally?
No, you're exactly right. It's volunteering opportunities, ways to improve the community that the employees live and work in. Getting the employer together to volunteer, the employees at a food pantry or, a shelter of some sort, engaging with the community in that way, because the employees really feel like the employer is investing in their lives and their community.
Well, that sounds great. One of the things that we've talked about for our clients is, this engagement. But another way that we've worked with our clients and friends is with a union vulnerability assessment that you just referred to. What kind of tool is that?
So I think that is kind of a little bit of what we're talking about here today is, assessing what the employees are looking for and where the employer is not, meeting those expectations or needs of the employees to see, where the vulnerability lies that would maybe make the employee less engaged and make the, work site more apt to be one that petitions for a union, goes through those labor actions.
Well, these are important tips and information. 32 strikes in 41 locations, 16 labor protests, plus 70% positive union opinion. This is a time to be engaged in understanding your workforce, your employees, and how I suppose the workforce in 2023 might look a good bit different than the workforce that existed in 2013. And thanks a lot for these insights. We really appreciate it, and we really appreciate your work with the rest of our team on the legal insights for manufacturing. Any sort of final thoughts for our audiences?
Well, Tom, I just want to say thank you for having me. I think this has been a really, timely and interesting discussion that we've had here today. And I think really the final thought is what we talked about here today isn't just about preventing, unionization at an employer's work site. It's about overall employee engagement and which will lead to a better workplace for everyone, employer, employee. So in the end, this isn't just necessarily, we don't want a union at our facility. It's how do we drive employee engagement in order to make a better workplace? In the end, I think a lot of employers will see driving that employee engagement is going to make a better company overall.
Well said. Thanks so much, Anne, for joining us, and thank you for joining the Labor Law Insider. If you found this helpful, share it with a friend. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.